Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for this past weekend in reading, which included Dewey's 24-hour readathon. Normally I'm not a big fan of periods where you're encouraged to just read and not do other things, because I feel like that's too life-limiting, but it just so happened that my usual weekend hiking partner was out of town for the week, and my husband was also out of town for the weekend. So I didn't have the usual social obligations that I might have had otherwise, so I thought, why not? I will give this a go. The first two things that I read were these two books in Nnedi Okorafor's Binti series. The first one, which is just called Binti, the second one is Binti Home, and I believe there's a third one of these that's going to be coming out over the winter. This is set in what might be an alternative universe and what might be a future version of our universe. The main character is a Himba girl from Namibia who is a math genius and gets accepted into an off-world university where she can go to school with aliens. And her family doesn't particularly agree with the idea that she's going, but she sneaks off and befriends members of hostile species, more or less. And then the second book is about her coming back home from university. She's planning to go on a pilgrimage, but something else happens and drama ensues. They are both very quick reads. This is under 100 pages. This is just over 150, which I always say this when I talk about science fiction and fantasy. I really like seeing shorter books. If anything, this one could have probably been a little bit longer. It is fun to read these and try to figure out if this is an alternative universe or if it is a future version of our world. Either way, North Africans don't come off very well. When I first started reading this and I hadn't read anything into it, and you kind of think of the relationship between the main character's people and these, and originally I thought they were pseudo-North African, but in the second one somebody is referred to as being Tamazite, so they clearly are North African. Then you think, okay, so did like Algeria move south all the way to Namibia? Like, what happened in this world? Or is it just an alternative universe where like colonialism happened differently? So I spent a lot of time thinking about that as opposed to thinking about the tentacle aliens, which I think is the main focus. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with these. They're so short that it's hard to talk about them without just telling you the whole story. And they're so short you might as well just read it to get the whole story. So after those, I picked up The Night Wanderer, which is a graphic novel adaptation of Drew Hayden Taylor's play, which is called, I don't remember what it's called now. It's drawn by Michael Wyatt, and the adaptation from the play is done by Alison Kooistra. Oh, interestingly, it actually says this isn't directly adapted. Now that I'm now reading the credits page, it actually says it's adapted from his novel, which he adapted from his play, which is called a native Gothic novel. So it is about a vampire who had left Canada in the days of the fur traders, who had met some of the early French fur traders, went over there, and has come back to what is now a reserve in Northern Ontario. There's a girl who's going through her teenage girl problems, and a vampire is boarding in their house. I felt like this wasn't as long as it should have been. I have not seen the play or read the novel that this is based on. I actually was looking for them, and my library didn't have either of those. This was all they had, so I went for that. And I imagine that there must be more to those, because I felt like this was more of an outline than an actual story. And I appreciated the outline, but I didn't feel like it was satisfying. There wasn't that much to it. I also felt like the art was strangely static. It's black and white, and it's not quite what I would call simple, and it has an interesting use of shading, but there's something about it that felt a little bit static to me. So I thought this was good enough, but not fabulous. Although, to be fair, this wasn't the version of the story I was looking for. This just happened to be what was available. After that, I read the Ikea catalog, but I don't think that counts. After that, I read Justice League of America Rebirth, Volume 1, The Extremists. I mentioned during my last wrap-up that I had read The Road to Rebirth, which was the introduction to all of the newer characters. That I enjoyed quite a bit more than I enjoyed this. This has one full story arc, which is about aliens come to Earth, and they're going to take over some Eastern European countries with fake names, which they then put on the map so you can see what countries they're supposed to be, but they're all given fake names, which is one of those things that drives me crazy in comic books. Now, there are a few that they started giving these countries fake names in the 50s, 60s, 70s, And you kind of go, okay, at this point, that's part of the continuity. Have to go with that. But to see new versions of this struck me as ridiculous. Especially, this is written by Steve Orlando, and he did, in Midnighter, for example, Midnighter goes to Russia. It's called Russia. But here they go to these fake countries, and yeah, I was not a fan of that. So I wasn't terribly impressed. It's kind of the cliche story, let's fight some big aliens and get things going. The second story, which leads off onto what I assume is a lead-in to the next collection, was more entertaining, so I will be curious to see where that goes. But again, this is a series that I'm going to read in collected version from the library. This is not a series where I'm buying the trades, or where and definitely not where I'm interested in looking at the issues. Next up, I switched to some poetry, and I read this collection of James Baldwin's poems, which is called Jimmy's Blues and Other Poems. First poem in here is called Staggerly Wonders, and it's about 18 pages long, and it's definitely the best thing in here. I would say there are about 3 poems in this collection that blew me away, and the rest of it was just okay. When you look at the dedications, it seems like a lot of these were actually just written for individuals, weren't necessarily written to be something that people other than those individuals were going to pay a lot of attention to, maybe. So I guess in that way it's kind of excusable, but at the same time, some of it felt very Dr. Seuss-y. There's a lot of rhyming. That said, the 3 that were super impressive were deeply impressive, so yeah, I mean, this is short enough that it was definitely worth picking up, and I tend to read poetry out loud, so I was reading this out loud to my dog. My dog fell asleep, but I don't think that's a judgment, because I don't think my dog is a great literary critic. And I definitely think this is interesting in terms of the political references and time and place, and how they compare to things that we still discuss now, which is interesting. And then finally I read Martha Wells' All Systems Red, which is the first volume in her Murderbot series. And it is an introduction to a character who is a semi-organic, semi-mechanical, not quite a robot, not quite a person. So this is a fantastic introduction to the character, who's very interesting, and also to the world where they have murderbots, for example. The main plot about companies looking for planetary exploration or salvage rights is a fairly standard science fiction plot, but I really enjoyed hearing about these created people and their adventures, and I would be curious to see where this goes. This was actually a book that my library had about 20 copies of, because it was the book that they're discussing, or that they were discussing in the science fiction book club. I missed that meeting and I hadn't read this in time, but now I have read it, so there we go. And again, as with everything else, this is quite short. This is around 150 pages. It was great fun. So that was my weekend in reading. I was really glad that I ended up going for getting through a bunch of short things, because I know I've picked up a lot of shorter novellas and shorter collected comics and graphic novels, and I tend to put off reading them because I think, well, that's so short, I could read that anytime. And then I don't get to them and have to take them back. So this was a great excuse to get through a bunch of stuff like that. Were you doing the readathon this weekend, or are you doing one of the other ones that are going on? Because I know there's an autumn readathon and a Halloween-related readathon, and there are all kinds of these things. If you're taking part, which ones are you doing? Are you doing all of them? And how do you keep track of that? Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.